Hello and welcome to this video about reproductive technologies. We're going to be thinking about selective breeding, artificial insemination as a way to do selective breeding in animals, that's known as AI. Also artificial pollination, a way of doing selective breeding in plants. So these are both agricultural applications of reproductive technologies. Also related to this, we have in vitro fertilization, which is IVF. That has some applications in agriculture as well, but also in medicine. So when we're thinking about reproductive technologies, let's have a look at this example, this case study. So in this case study, we can see this is reproductive technology applied to animals. So we're talking about agriculture. Put that one down there. And we're looking at selective breeding through the use of artificial insemination. So if you look at the farmer or the vet over here, there's a long artificial vagina that's just going to be inserted just as the bull mounts the cow, and so the ejaculate's going to be collected in that. Then one ejaculation can then be distributed amongst many small vials so that each little packet of sperm that can be packaged up actually can be used for one successful fertilization of a cow. So that means that one ejaculation from a bull, maybe a prize bull with particular desired features, could actually inseminate 100 or 1,000 female cows. And that could be locally, it could be nationally, it could be across the world. So when we have a think about the kind of scientific knowledge that we need in order to carry out selective breeding through AI, we really are talking about an understanding of reproductive hormones and the reproductive cycles of animals, because we need to be able to manipulate the female's reproductive cycle so that a whole field of cows can all be inseminated on the same day, and therefore they all give birth at around the same time, which saves on costs and helps the farmer to plan his or her income. The sorts of desirable features that we would be looking for when we're selecting the animal for the selective breeding will be a way to increase yield. So you can see with my image in the center here, this is a cow that has been selectively bred to be incredibly high yielding for its milk, producing far more milk than it would need for its own calf alone. You can also breed for cows with a better temperament, or maybe bulls or bullocks for better temperament, so they're easier to handle. There are also big advantages to being able to store the sperm in liquid nitrogen for prolonged periods of time, which means you can continue the pedigree of a bull well after the bull has died. And there's also big advantages to being able to transport the sperm rather than transporting a prize animal. It's much lower cost and less risk. However, we do need to consider some ethical issues, and these include things like reducing the fertility of animals. There's been a lot of research and data collected that over time, high-yielding milk dairy cattle have very reduced fertility. So they're becoming more and more dependent on the AI technology, the artificial insemination technology, to even be able to become pregnant. Animal welfare can be an issue. You need to look after these animals really well. And there's also the problem if you don't keep good records of inbreeding, and you don't want animals that are too closely related actually producing offspring. So we also need to put some consideration into biodiversity. That comes in under the inbreeding. So we need to be careful that we understand the genetic pedigrees of these animals. But it actually could be seen to increase biodiversity sometimes, because you can introduce sperm from one animal to another area of the world entirely, where by normal processes that animal would never get to. So you could actually change gene pools of herds in another area of the world. So there are both pluses and minuses when it comes to the impacts on diversity. Let's look at our next example, which is looking at the reproductive technology of in vitro fertilization, or IVF. And this is different to AI, artificial insemination, because the fertilization takes place outside of the body. In vitro literally means in glass. There are medical applications for this. We can treat infertility in humans. And if you combine this with genetic screening, you can also look for genetic diseases that are known and make sure that those are not the embryos that are chosen. Let's just space these out a little bit more. And there are applications in agriculture too, where we can actually improve the reproductive potential of female animals. So in the last slide, we were talking about artificial insemination, and that's where we collect a lot of sperm. So the male animal gets to pass on their genetic information. Here, we can actually collect eggs, which means that the female's reproductive potential and desired traits can be selected for. When we're using it in animals, you can actually collect the eggs from very young animals, because eggs are already partway through meiosis when the animal is born. So after a matter of weeks, say 8 or 9 weeks, you can actually treat an animal, a female animal, with hormones to allow ovulation, even though that animal might actually not yet be sexually mature in age. And you can wash out the eggs, collect the eggs, and then implant them into a surrogate ewe that is much bigger. And therefore, you've used eggs without having to wait for that animal to become an adult. So the time between generations can get shorter. So that's a big advantage in agriculture and speeding up the generations. Obviously, there are some ethical issues with this, because there are increased complications with pregnancy and birth that have been noted when using IVF, particularly in animals. Not so much in people, but definitely in animals. Our last example is looking at a reproductive technology in plants. So this is selective breeding, but we are talking this time about artificial pollination and the production of hybrids. So bringing together plants to make a cross, a hybrid, two things coming together. This time we need to know quite a lot about pollination, about reproduction in plants, and about flower structure. If you're going to be moving pollen from the anthers of the male plant to the stigma of a female plant, you have to understand when they're going to ripen, the best time to collect them, when they're going to be ripe to receive as well as to give the pollen, and to understand how the life cycle of the germination, of the pollination takes place and of fertilization, and then collect the seeds correctly so that you can then grow them and make the next generation. So there's lots of things in here that's slightly different from the animal knowledge, but different scientific knowledge that you need. The example I've got in the picture here is rice, and there are huge numbers of different types of rice around. And in particular, the case study I'm thinking about here is in India and what's called the Green Revolution, when a huge number of new varieties of rice were selectively bred that were shorter and sturdier and faster growing and higher yielding. So the sorts of desirable features they had were that they produced a high quantity of rice, and the actual size of the grains improved. The storage time of the rice was better. There were disease-resistant varieties, and they were tastier. So all of those were desired qualities, and it made India move from being not from not having any kind of rice industry to suddenly it became a country that was able to export huge amounts of crops, and it was incredibly economically impactful. As a result of this, though, there was an increase in the fossil fuels and the fertilizers used in farming, which had a negative environmental impact. However, you were able to feed very many more people in India itself, and as a knock-on of that, because of the financial improvement, the economic improvement, there was an increased economic viability of the country. So all of those things, kind of pluses and minuses, you have to kind of bring them all together. When we think about biodiversity, again, there are both reductions and increases in biodiversity. So for a start, by actually looking for new varieties of rice and seeking them out and selecting them and using those for the next generation, you are increasing genetic diversity. You're getting varieties that might not have lived for very long in the wild, and you are cultivating them on purpose. However, if you've got a particularly popular variety of rice and everyone wants to grow it, then you're going to reduce genetic diversity because you'll end up with a very small number of rice varieties being grown. So we need to think, when we're thinking about plants, about long-term sustainability. So we need to be thinking about is this a good thing in the long term for that country, for that crop, for that variety? So obviously all of these are great examples for agricultural case studies. And that's a good summary of all our different reproductive technologies, and not just how to do them, but also their impact on biodiversity, economics, environment, social, and also thinking about why we would do it.